Some guys on this job, fire owns them. Makes them fight it on its level. But the only way to truly kill it is to love it a little.
I Almost Quit, submitted by N.A. Firefighter. This happened when I was just a probie with my town's volunteer fire company. I'd been an explorer for 2 years and did spend a lot of time at the hall on the fringes of fires, but obviously not right in the thick of things. Once I turned 18 and got fully accepted as a member of the crew, I started to gain more experience and started to learn more and more about the job. Let me say straight out on the top that I'm still a volunteer, a different part of the state and a different crew, but I love what I do and I take my oath seriously. It can be tough and devastating, as all firefighters know, but it's also some of the most rewarding things I have ever experienced in my life. Early on in my service, though, I almost gave it all up. It was in the summer of that year that we got a call for a rager, a fire in a 2-story house that was quickly spreading, and it looked like the houses next door were also in jeopardy. I had my blue lights on in my pickup truck and was getting there as fast as I could. When I got there, it was being handled as best it could be, but it turned into a 3-bagger, and later 2 more companies were on their way to help out. Like we thought, the wind spread the flames to the building next door, and for some reason the occupants had not come out of their house, and there was confusion as to if there was anyone even inside. Someone had gone over and rang the bell and pounded on the doors, but no one answered. My chief told me to go over and make sure anyone inside was getting out before things got worse, and if anyone was in there, how they didn't feel the heat from next door or smell the smoke was a mystery to all of us. So, me and a partner were busting ass to the front door of this place that is now engulfed on the top floor, and the fire is now downstairs, too. Before we hit the first step of the porch, the front door blasted open, and out comes this screaming woman carrying a small child, and it seems like she's slipping or sliding across the porch as she moves towards us. My partner scooped her up, and I took the child, and there were paramedics right behind us in a flash, as we were asking if there was anyone else in the house. She kept screaming, "No, no," and to keep my child safe, keep my baby safe. We did, and they were okay, but when we turned her over to the guys in the gut wagon, I looked down and realized why it looked like she was running funny. Her feet were basically melting off her legs. She was so far gone into shock, I don't think she even knew it. From what we learned, she was asleep in an upstairs room when the fire hit her place and the flames surrounded her. She jumped up and ran to get her kid, and the carpeting and fire and whatever else was on the floor basically stuck to her feet, burning them severely, and she just barreled down the stairs and out the door as her flesh was disintegrating. For a moment, I almost puked, and I stepped off to the side before getting my act together and getting back into things. Honestly, I forgot about it for the next 3 hours, but when things were contained, it came back to me, and I seriously questioned if I had the stomach for this kind of work. Someone told the chief and lieutenant how I was doing after my first big job, and they came over to talk with me. I told them about the woman's feet, and I just couldn't get it out of my head, and they just nodded. My chief looked at me and said, "Hey, we've all been there. Stick with it. You're a good Jake." I'll never forget him saying that. It's been 24 years, and I look back and tell myself, the reason you got into this job was to help a person like that woman. I've never forgotten it either. I saw her years later at school at a function for my daughter. She had lost both of her feet, but learned to walk with prosthetics and was very active in the PTO. I'm not sure what happened because we moved right after that. I hope she's still doing well. I also hope you share my story, Josh. Thanks if you do. To all my brothers out there, stay safe. Complacency. The familiar click of the speakers turning on let me know we were all getting a call about a second before the tones went off. If you're used to working at my station, you can hear that quiet click over all kinds of ambient noise. we were being dispatched for a residential fire alarm. We roll on a lot of false alarms. Residential fire alarms are almost always the result of someone overcooking their dinner or a bag of popcorn. So many false alarms can lead to complacency, just like the villagers in the story of the boy who cried wolf. We were just like those villagers, unprepared to act when the time came. We pulled up to the 3-unit apartment complex and found the courtyard between the building and the one next to it full of people, including a lot of kids. It was a weekend, and it wasn't too cold, and it wasn't too late in the evening. Besides, the fire department was coming. Everyone likes to see a spectacle. My captain and I were both turned out, but neither of us had our bottles on. There was no smoke. This was another false alarm. We headed over to the apartment and someone approached us. They said that they lived above the unit in question, and they heard the smoke detector going off below them and smelled something like burning food. They had knocked on the door, but no one answered. It wouldn't be the first time that we've been to a house where someone left a pot on the stove. We knocked on the door again just to be sure, and we also checked the windows. They were all closed and locked, and the curtains were drawn. The windows and the door were also cool to the touch, so there was little concern. We determined that the renters and the manager had been called, but there was no answer. With the indications we had that something wasn't right, my captain gave me the word. It was forcible entry time. Let me just take a moment to say how much I love being a firefighter. It's fun, especially at times like this. I was already lined up with the front door, and I did a forward kick that would have made my kid's MMA instructor proud. When the door flew back, I was greeted by a wall of smoke that extended from the ceiling to the ground. Crap. My captain and I ran back to the rig to grab our bottles, and we should have had them on already. Again, crap, I hate that feeling. I grabbed the pack from my seat and threw it on while I walked back to the apartment. Now the crowd had moved back. No one wanted to get in our way, and by the time I reached the door, I was masked up. I stepped up to the doorway and then disappeared into the smoke. While the entire place was filled with smoke, it wasn't thick and black. There was also no accompanying heat. The fire had snuffed itself out, suffocated, starved for oxygen. I made my way to the kitchen and found that there was indeed a pot on the stove with the burner going. The family had placed several baby bottles in a pot of boiling water to sterilize them and forgotten about it. Once the water had boiled off, the plastic started to burn, and the knobs on the stove were melted and the paint on the wall was charred and blistered. We opened the windows and doors and used a fan to remove the smoke, and then we removed the burnt items out of the house and then disconnected the stove and moved it to the center of the kitchen. With all of that done, we again checked to make sure the fire hadn't moved into the walls or the cabinets. It could have been much worse. At least they had working smoke detectors, and I learned a valuable lesson about complacency. Crazy People, submitted by Firefighter 23. I wanted to relate these stories to you because I'm a big fan of your YouTube, and I'm also a firefighter. This first story took place about 15 years ago in a rural part of the town that I live in. We only have one company that I volunteer with, so we get sent out on a lot of calls out in the boonies. This one time, it was just about Thanksgiving, and a person called in about a fire on a property out past my place. So I got ready, kissed my wife and kids goodbye, and they told me to be safe, and off I went. I drove over to the place and was the first one there, as I did live close by, and it was going to be a few minutes before any of my brothers would show up. I saw smoke and I smelled it, but I could tell right away it wasn't coming from the house, the car parked outside, or a barn that was in the back. So I walk around the side of the building and can see that it looks like a leaf fire or something is out of control and spreading across the ground. I grab my cell, call it into the chief, and then run back to my truck to get my fire extinguisher I always keep in the cab. I ran back and put out the fire. It really wasn't all that big. And that's when I heard this moaning noise, like someone was just waking up. I noticed what looks like blood on the ground, and there's a trail of it leading from a pile of wood towards the barn. Someone had been chopping wood near the leaf fire, but they weren't there anymore, so of course I thought maybe someone was in trouble because of the blood. And I was right. I followed the trail of blood to the side door of the barn, and I peeked into a little room, and there, laying on the floor, was the homeowner holding a bloody axe. He was just laying there and moaning, and I could see blood pooling underneath his foot and what looked like a pile of grapes on top of his foot. It was coagulated blood. I immediately called the chief again, who was close by, and I could hear our trucks coming down the road, too. I started giving the guy first aid after I established he was awake enough for me to talk to him, and his breath reeked of beer, and he was clearly more than 3 sheets to the wind. My brothers finally pulled in, and an ambulance had been called too, and we kept the guy talking through his blood loss and drunkenness, and we began to piece together what had happened. The guy had been drinking all day, and then for some reason decided it was time to burn some leaves in his bonfire pit. Then he decided to chop some wood for a fire in his fireplace for later that night. Then he slipped with a swing of his axe and basically cleaved his right foot in 2 from the toes down to the middle of his foot. I suppose I should mention he was doing all of this barefoot, right? Yeah, real smart. He crawled into the barn for some reason instead of crawling to his house, and eventually the fire got out of hand, and that's when a neighbor called it in. While we were working on him, he kept asking us for another beer, practically oblivious to the fact of what he'd done. I will never forget the way his foot looked. Seriously, I'm not kidding, it looked like someone plopped a bunch of grapes on his foot. Totally gross. My other story is kind of a nick-of-time story that didn't happen to me, but happened to the guy who got me into my company that I volunteer with. I'll call him Joe for this story. Joe was hanging around the fire hall one morning helping wash the trucks for a big town parade coming up, when a call came in from an apartment building. A person on the first floor was complaining of a noxious odor coming from somewhere, but it wasn't like that rotten egg smell you get with natural gas warnings. They called the gas company anyway, and they all got on over to the building to check it out. From the outside, Joe said everything was kosher, but the man who called was waiting in the doorway of the apartment building, ready to lead the guys to his place to check things out. Joe asked if the landlord had been contacted, and the guy said he called and left a message, but the landlord wasn't a local and lived somewhere out of town. The guys went into his apartment, and there definitely was a noxious odor that they all thought smelled something like lighter fluid, but not quite. They checked the guy's stove and oven, and they were fine. Pilot lights were burning blue, and there were no leaks. So Joe goes down to the basement where the meter is, and things are looking good there as well. By now, a guy from the gas company had arrived, and he checked over everything, and all was kosher, as I said. They couldn't figure it out. By now, the other tenants had come out of their places to see what was going on, and our guys asked if they could check on their places as well. The other person downstairs' place was fine, and the person on the second floor above them was also okay. So they knock on the 4th apartment door, and no one answers. The other tenants say a woman and her son live there, but no one had seen them that morning or for a little while for that matter. Joe knocked on the door again, and then got down on the floor to see if the smell might be coming from inside, and he caught a faint whiff of the funny smell. Someone got the landlord on the phone, and they got permission to break the door down. So boom, door goes in, followed by Joe and the crew, and they stumble onto a terrible scene. The woman and her 6 or 7-year-old son were duct taped to chairs in the living room, like totally wrapped up with only their noses visible. There was some kind of liquid all over the floor, and a candle burning down just a few feet away from them. Joe orders a guy to call the police, and they put out the candle and start to check on the woman and her kid. They were really sluggish and barely responding to the help that arrived, and the police came, and there was a huge investigation, and what came out is a true horror show. The woman's ex-boyfriend had come over the night before and drugged their food without them knowing, while he was pleading with her to get back together. The woman said no, and the guy waited for them to fall asleep from the drugs, and when they did, he taped them to the chairs, dumped some kind of flammable liquid all over them and the floor, and then put a candle down in a way that it would fall over after it burned down a ways and he was long gone. Please forgive me, I can't remember what the liquid was called. I almost didn't send this story because of that. So yeah, this guy was going to burn his ex-girlfriend and her kid alive, and likely the whole building down too, and no one would ever have known what was going on. Both of them were okay, and the fire inspector said they were lucky their neighbor called, because it was only a matter of maybe another half hour before the guy's plan would have started rolling. Joe always talked about what a close call that was, and how if they hadn't checked around as fast as they did, that woman and her son might not have made it out of there alive. The scariest part? To my knowledge, the guy who did it was never caught. My Firefighter Horror Stories by Angry Brute. Since I'm in a sharing mood, I feel like discussing the horrific events that I've seen in my former years as a volunteer firefighter. A wonderful experience it was as a whole, but there were still some very haunting moments that plague my mind to this day. I was in high school at this point in time, and I always kept my radio in my truck in case I got a call when I left. Sure enough, one day that thing went off and said, "Winnie Stoll Volunteer Fire Department, please be en route to a 1050 major." That's code for a bad wreck. This was not a bad wreck like you would expect it to be. It was not some pile-up or a collision of two or more vehicles. No, it just so happened to be a motorcycle. A crotch rocket, to be exact. This guy had the bright idea to nearly top 200 miles per hour on his bike on a highway. He was going so fast, he didn't notice the gaping pothole in front of him. His front tire hit it, and it threw him and the bike head over tail for more than 100 yards. It literally tore him down to nothing. The same happened with his bike. Where his remains ended, his bike began several feet onward. Just a heap of remains in front of what seemingly looked like red paint. There was nothing we could do, really, besides clear the bike and create a containment zone. Just seeing something like that gave me a new outlook and gratefulness to be alive. The dumbest of things can go so wrong so fast. I mean, literally, just before we got there, this guy was alive, and at that moment, he was gone. My next story is one that was during the aftermath of Hurricane Ike. Now I guess you know where I live. We got called out to help search and rescue after the storm had passed, and we had to go down to the beach, which was about 15 minutes from us. The storm reshaped out entire coastlines. Houses, land, everything had gone into the Gulf. The place pretty much looked like the wasteland in Fallout 3, only much more surreal. Well, once we were on the scene, we started off searching the houses on the bay side. The houses were nothing more than twigs, and the cars were all piled up together in the water or buried halfway in the sand. We started searching this one ruined house, and what we found was, for lack of a better word, horrifying. 4 bodies were in there, covered in sand and pale as the clouds. It was very easy to tell that they were a family because it was a husband and wife and 2 children. Goddamn, children. They couldn't have been more than 7 years old. We noticed they had markings on their arms. It was faint, but you could still make it out. They had written their social security numbers on each of their arms for identification. Now, before the storm hit this area, everyone was under mandatory evacuation orders. Yet these people stayed and kept their children in harm's way. I don't know them, but to put your own kids in that kind of a place with a storm coming, I still don't know what possessed them to believe that it was a good idea to this day. An entire family gone because they did not heed the warnings given to them. If you can only imagine my anger when I saw that. Warehouse Fire by Scott. Most of the things we see as firefighters aren't really appropriate for public discussion. But the one thing I can say that scared the ever-living crap out of me, and I don't think it's the scariest thing I've ever done, but it is something I can comment on, was a fire in a large warehouse that had huge vats of formaldehyde and a few other hazardous materials, either burning or right in the fire. The fire had been burning for a few hours prior to the original fire department's call going out. They called a box alarm, means calling for help from surrounding fire departments, and we responded with our ladder truck. It was about a 5-story building in height, but had no individual floors, just an open floor plan. Our crew was asked to ventilate the roof, But when we got up on it, you could feel the roof bowing and moving. My captain made the decision to continue on because the building really needed to be ventilated. 3 of us had to carry our saws and axes towards the area directly over the fire in full gear and breathing from our air packs. To minimize the risks to us, we also carried a roof ladder in between our legs as we crossed to where we needed to be. This was in case a hole opened up in the roof. We would land on the ladder between our legs, and hopefully the hole wouldn't be bigger than the ladder. It was the quickest job of ventilating I have ever done. We cut our hole in the roof and made a rapid exit, all the while sweating bullets. I can't say it was the right decision to do so. We had many discussions with our captain afterwards as to the safety of doing it. But all firefighters know they will sometimes go up against life-threatening situations, and in this case, the roof wasn't opening up on its own, as we had hoped, and we needed to release the superheated air and smoke out to make it a little safer for the crews going inside to fight the fire. I decided afterwards that I would never do something that dangerous again, unless a life depended on it. Needless to say, I won't go into any of the emergency rescue calls we've had to go on, as they can be very traumatizing just to talk about them. The School Fires, submitted by Torchy LaFlame. Heard the call for Firefighter Stories, so here I am. What I'm about to tell you took place in the fall of 1990. I lived in a suburb of Chicago and was 26 at the time, and I'd been a volunteer fireman for 6 years at that point when this all went down. I'm not making any of this up, and the guys I was with this night still tell this story. It was a Saturday night, and I was hanging out at our hall because my girlfriend was out of town, and the place had just been built. Back then, you could still have a bar area, and we had a huge big screen TV and a pool table, all kinds of stuff to relax with when you weren't out on calls. And no, you couldn't drink if you were on a call, and you certainly couldn't go to a call if you had been, so don't bring that up in the comments. Anyway, we were playing NHL 91 on Sega, and a call came in through dispatch that came from the area middle school. The weird thing was that it came from a classroom, which would be highly irregular, seeing it was a Saturday night, and no one should have been in the school. The first call was a hang-up, but 2 more came in, and the dispatcher, a wonderful woman named Josette, said she could faintly hear someone saying, "There's a fire." So we gear up and head over after our chief called the superintendent of the school and the building principal to let them know we got the call. We sent 1 truck, our medic detail, and a town police officer came out with us too. When we got there, there was no visible smoke or flames that we could see, but that doesn't really mean anything. If it was contained inside, we might be able to work it without spreading. The school principal told us that no one was on staff that night, and that he'd meet us over there. So my partners Sean and Brad accessed the building while 2 others waited for the word outside. The police officer was this old guy named Bill, and he came inside with us. We started to check out the first floor and found nothing. Sean ran down to the basement and came up a minute later and said all was well. Second floor suite was the same thing. Not a thing was out of place. Dispatch called out and said whoever was calling did so again 3 times since we entered the building, and when we got to the 3rd floor, we all smelled smoke. We immediately changed attitudes from vigilant to hyper-aware and followed the scent of the smoke. I'll tell you right now, there was no actual smoke, just the smell of it on the air. We didn't see anything. We went room to room, and Brad stopped for 1 second in a room and yelled out, "Hey, there's somebody in there!" The rest of us were on the other side of the hallway and ran over to look in the door window and to get to work on opening it. But I stopped when I didn't see anything. Neither did Sean. Neither did Bill, but Brad insisted that he had seen someone standing in the room. Just then the principal, a guy named Larry or Harry or something like that, came jogging up to us with his keys jingling. Bill asked him to open the door, and he did. We got inside, and there was nothing but an empty chemistry room. The smell of smoke was gone, and we all just kind of stood there looking at each other with questioning looks. Dispatch said the call came in again, but we radioed back saying there was nothing wrong at the school. Then Larry, or whatever, piped in and said, "I'll be dipped in shit." Brad looked at him and said, "What?" "You guys aren't going to believe this, but this is the story. Back in the late 60s, there was a kid who got killed up here. Well, more to the point, he killed himself. We all stood there looking at him like he was bullshitting us, but he told us this crazy story that I've later found out was 100% true. This young guy had found out that at the end of his senior year in high school, and this used to be the high school and was now a middle school. Anyway, this guy found out that his girlfriend was dumping him. He had been denied entry into the army, and his brother had been killed in Vietnam. All of this happened within like a month, and he was a wreck, obviously, and he snapped. He broke into the school, went to his old chemistry room, and doused himself with gas or something flammable, set himself on fire with one of the classroom's Bunsen burners. I wouldn't have believed it if we all didn't look into it later. It was all true, and there's even a plaque in the school in memorial of the guy. I went back later and looked at it. So the kicker? They determined that the calls to us about the fire were coming from that room we had been in. It was pretty close to the anniversary of the date that he took his life. As for what Brad saw, I don't know, but I believe him. Too many weird things happened that night to just be a coincidence, and he certainly could not have known about the suicide or what room it happened in before we got there. So, yeah, no courageous stories of me saving a family of 5 or licking the flames of death, although some of that has happened in my career. This was just one strange call. Nothing like that has ever happened to me again. What happened in Webster? Okay, guys, this isn't a first-person story, but it is a retelling of a true story that happened in a town about an hour from me. It hits close to home because I have family that lives in this town, I have friends who live in that town, and I did spend a lot of time there when I was in college, was dating a girl from that area as well. So, this is just a retelling of what actually happened in December of 2012. In the early morning of December 24th, 2012, firefighters responded to a fire in West Webster, New York, a suburb of Rochester. They were fired upon by a 62-year-old William H. Spengler, who is believed to have deliberately set the fire. 2 of the firefighters were killed. According to police, Spengler set his house and the family car on fire at 191 Lake Road in the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, and then armed himself with 3 weapons: a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver, a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun, and a .223 caliber Bushmaster semi-automatic rifle. When firefighters arrived shortly after 5:30 a.m., Spengler ambushed them from an earthen berm across the street from his house. Spengler exchanged shots with police, who arrived with an armored truck to remove the firefighters and 33 nearby civilians. Spengler ran after getting shot at and died when he shot himself in the head. His body was discovered about 6 hours later. Due to the shooting, fire crews were unable to resume fighting the blaze until 11:30 a.m. By then, 6 other houses had burned to the ground, and 2 others had been rendered uninhabitable. A severely burned body found inside Spengler's house is believed to be Spengler's 67-year-old sister Cheryl, with whom he was living. The shooting is suspected as following an argument between Spengler and his sister. A 3-page typewritten letter written by Spengler was also found at the scene. It reflected Spengler's intent to ambush first responders, but offered no motive for the shooting. In it he wrote, quote, "I still have to get ready to see how much of the neighborhood I can burn down, and do what I like doing best: killing people." The 2 firefighters killed in the shooting were 43-year-old Michael Schiaparini, past chief of the West Webster Fire District and lieutenant and public information officer for the Webster Police Department. He was killed along with 19-year-old Tomasz Kachawa, who was also working as a 911 dispatcher. The 2 wounded firefighters were Joseph Hofstetter, who was shot in the pelvis, with the bullet then lodging in his spine, and Theodore Scardino, who was shot in the chest and knee. Both were hospitalized at Strong Memorial Hospital for serious injuries and were declared to be in stable condition. In addition to the 2 wounded firefighters, police officer John Ritter was slightly injured when a bullet hit the windshield of his car. Spengler had previously spent 17 years in prison for murdering his 92-year-old grandmother with a hammer in 1980. He had not attracted the attention of police since then. William Spengler could not stand his sister Cheryl, according to a friend. Spengler's mother Arlene, to whom he was said to have been close to, had died 2 months earlier to the shooting. Investigators immediately began focusing on how Spengler obtained the gun. New York, like many other states, bars convicted felons from buying, owning, or possessing a firearm. Before the day was out, agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms discovered that the Bushmaster rifle and the shotgun had been purchased in June 2010 at Gander Mountain in Henrietta, another Rochester suburb. The owner of record was Dawn Nguyen, a neighbor of Spengler, who had recently moved to the suburb of Greece. In an interview with agents that night, Nguyen admitted to buying the guns, but claimed that they had been stolen. However, according to investigators, Nguyen texted a Monroe County Sheriff's deputy the next day and admitted buying the guns for Spengler in an illegal straw purchase. On December 28th, William Hochul, the United States Attorney for the Western District of New York, announced that Nguyen had been arrested and charged with knowingly making a false statement in connection with the purchase of a firearm from a federal firearms licensee. She also faced state charges of filing a false business record, the form she filled out stating that she was the owner of the guns. In 2014, Nguyen was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her involvement. As part of the New York SAFE Act, the New York Penal Law section on aggravated murder added the Webster provision named for this incident. It amended the legislation to increase penalties for murdering a first responder to life in prison without parole. Hey gang, thanks for listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed these special stories about our firefighters. These guys put their butt on the line every time they go to a call, and we can't thank our first responders enough, no matter what capacity they serve in. So to all you firefighters, first responders, and police out there, thanks for doing what you do. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and make sure you hit that little bell next to subscribe so you'll get notifications for all my new uploads. Please follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you so care to, join me on Patreon. You can become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 per month, and you will get early release of all my content before I upload to YouTube. You can also find my podcasts at iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Spreaker if you enjoy it in that format. Please send all of your scary stories to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. And don't forget, we're working on the Halloween special, so if you have any Halloween scary stories, send them my way. I read them all. Until next time, everyone be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. Could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.